We are back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us. We're talking about voting redistricting and how it affects certain voting groups, especially some of the protected classes. Kendra Lee's with us with Equity Alliance. We were talking, the producer and I, during the break, Kendra, about this topic. And it's complex, but it is fascinating. And it really has an impact. And we should say then, the idea right now is lawmakers are proposing some major changes to the maps divvying up voting in various congressional districts, and really targeted, among others, are two of the state's biggest Democratic strongholds, as we said, Nashville and Memphis. So, Kendra, you did a great job of kind of laying out what we see happening here. So the fact that they'll be splitting up Davidson County into 3 districts and breaking up the core voting block of basically blacks in this area and splitting them up, what does that mean for African American representation?
So, Nick, you make a great point. And so typically when you talk about the entire concept of voting anyways, it's supposed to be that elected officials do work on behalf of their constituents. And so when you talk about issues that may arise and why they have the importance of why those need to be addressed, you have to take those issues over to your elected officials. And so currently, all of Davidson County is encompassed in one congressional district as it stands right now. And so also our current congressperson is responsible for a lot of the immigration, calls to action that we have because we have such a large community of minorities. And so we have people that are coming from everywhere, from all parts of the country, from all parts of from the world. And so a lot of the times to be able to say that we want to be able to see better with our immigration reform, we want to be able to make sure that the process is legitimate, the process is correct, or also just having a congressperson that's going to be attentive to your needs when you call them out about things that are missing or, that you see there's a lack of in your certain communities. And so when you talk about diluting the voting power, a lot of the times, unfortunately, elected officials will not take heed to your request if there isn't really any possibility that you can vote them out, right? And so I know a lot of the times we say, oh, if you don't like what your elected official is doing, vote for somebody else. It seems pretty straightforward. But when you have individuals that tend to use the redistricting process to gerrymander, it's literally a very complicated situation to say, we'll just vote you out. Because if they draw a district to where they know you cannot vote them out, then there isn't really any incentive for them to be as responsive to their constituents as they need to. And so, for instance, there are parts of the congressional districts that are proposed that are well over 100 miles away from the core of Nashville. And so when you think about what that looks like and what kind of impact that will have, if you run the risk of never even physically putting eyes on your elected official because they live 100 miles away from you. And so it is hard to see what's happening in your community. It is hard to see what's happening in your neighborhood. It is hard to hold your elected official accountable when you know that there's a chance that you may literally never put eyes on them and you won't have to because their office is 100 miles away from where you live.
Yeah. Do you think with this getting done, and if it happens and stands, that, longtime Democratic representatives like Jim Cooper and Steve Cohen, incumbents, will be voted out and replaced with Republicans?
So the way that it looks now, we have 9 congressional seats, and right now it's 7-2, 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And so even though the majority party is making this move so where they can try to do it to where it might be an 8-1, for there to be 8 Republicans and for 1 Democrat to be in the state, for 2022, they might achieve that, right? But we do have to take into consideration that this is a 10-year plan. This is a long-term situation. And so if Middle Tennessee continues to grow at the rate in which it's growing, this may actually be a huge pie in the face to their selfishness to where you may actually allow that Middle Tennessee area to flourish with its growth to the point where when you were trying to break up that political power in one district, what you did was just allow it to spill over into multiple other districts that can be influenced. We might not know what, these communities will look like within the next 3 years, within the next 5. So eventually within the next 10, it can be completely different because look at how that area looks different now from 10 years ago.
Oh,
we wouldn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was just thinking, and I was trying to see the other side of it, and I hadn't thought of that. I mean, the growth here, and I don't know as much in Memphis, but here in the Nashville area, the growth is insane. I mean, it is fast and growing, and it looks so much different from 10 years ago. Don't get me started. And a lot of these people are moving here from outside the state. Probably Democrats and Republicans. It's a mixed bag coming in. But you're saying there is some risk to what the Republican leadership is doing here, at least maybe up front at the outset. It may have a positive impact, but by extending these districts out more, if the growth continues, it could backfire.
Absolutely. And just think about it, because if you keep these districts the way that they are, the ideal congressional population is a little bit over 767,000 people per district. And I believe that Nashville's population may be right around that area because we proposed a map and it encompassed all of Davidson County and just a little bit of the northwestern portion of Rutherford County, which also has a huge minority population. So Nashville just about can take up an entire congressional district on its own. So if you split that up, that means that you're roughly putting around 200,000 people into another district that they hadn't been in before. And that could be a huge impact on that congressional district. And so especially when you talk about, we know that when you talk about voter outcome and voter turnout, that Davidson County tends to be on the higher end of voter turnout, just in general, no matter what the party affiliation is. There's a greater risk that there are going to be so many people of that 200,000 plus that impact wherever you put them to where it can completely change the trajectory of what's going on in these other congressional areas. Like I said, there may be a very short-term win based on the current number right now of saying we have allotted just enough numbers for people to be able to get a preferred candidate with the partisan gerrymandering. Like they may have just did it perfectly to where they're saying, we know we can get 3 Republicans in these areas right now. But as we mentioned before, the population may boom, it may double, it may triple within the next 5 years. And so you can't change those districts the way that they look until the next 10 years. So you really set yourself up for a lot of uncertainty about how this can be able to do. Because at the end of the day, 5 years from now, we may be having a completely different conversation to where instead of an 8-1 setup, you might end up having a 4-5, just depending on how that growth is going to be able to impact it to where you tried to gerrymander to steal 1 seat and ended up losing 3. And so that is why, from a political perspective, I just don't know if the benefits outweigh the risk in this point because it just doesn't make enough sense. There's not enough certainty. What we do know for certain is that Middle Tennessee the population has expanded, explosive growth. And if that explosive growth, that trend continues, then it's probably going to be a huge setback to the majority party, thinking that they were slick and they were able to do something to where they could be able to grab these 3 seats and end up, down the line, a couple years from now, losing their political leverage because they decided that their eyes were bigger than their bellies. And
what you're saying there, and we'll go to a break, but what you're saying there is that by doing this, potentially down the road, it's going to open up for other candidates to maybe have success in races outside the Nashville area where maybe in the past they would have had no choice, but because part of that Nashville core is now in this other district, I guess if I'm a Republican lawmaker in a district on the fringe here, I may not be thrilled with this because all of a sudden it means there's going to be more voters that may not be as like-minded with me here. and they're going to come in and it may open it up for a challenger, while in the short term, at least in the city, it may put in jeopardy some of the local lawmakers that are elected by Democrats. So listen, on that note, let's take a break. I'll let you elaborate on that. But also, despite what you just said, and you're correct, I know Equity Alliance and others still don't think this is right and would prefer it not to be done this way. So we'll get into that, and also we'll touch in our next two segments about the possibility of legal challenges with Kendra Lee and the Equity Alliance right after this. Stay with us.